related to the reproductive system. As a result, we'll study these two systems together. Up here, in the dorsal wall of the abdomen, we see a pair of kidneys. These kidneys are covered with a tissue called peritoneum, as a result, referred to as retroperitoneal. The peritoneum is still intact on this kidney. On this kidney over here, I've removed it to expose the kidney. On the medial border of the kidney, there's a tube emerging from the kidney and extending caudally. This tube is a ureter. It will function in carrying the expiratory waste filtered by the kidney down to the bladder where that urine will be stored. Note that the bladder is a large sac-like structure that is sandwiched between these two umbilical arteries. The urinary bladder then will store the urine, and then when the urine is excreted from the body, it will pass down through this tube, which is known as urethra. The urethra will continue throughout this tubular structure, which is known as the penis. The urine is then excreted through the urogenital opening. In observing the reproductive organs, we look down in this area where, in studying the external anatomy, we looked at the scrotal sac. Within the scrotal sac are a pair of testes. On this side, we see a vaginal tunic covering the testis. On the other side, I've removed the vaginal tunic, exposing this bean-shaped structure, which is called the testis. The testes in the adult male produce a sperm, and then those sperm are stored in this coiled structure, which is known as the epididymis. When the sperm are released from the male body, they're released from the epididymis, pass up through the sperm duct. Eventually, the sperm duct will lead through the penis and be released to the urogenital opening. So the urogenital opening serves two functions. One, the removal of urine, and the other, the release of sperm. We are now ready to study the female anatomy. In the abdominal wall of the female, we see a pair of small ovaries, which will function in producing the eggs in the adult female. On the back side of the ovaries, there's a very small coiled tube called the uterine tube, in which the eggs will be released into. Coming from the uterine tubes are these uterine horns, which will form the body of the uterus. Within the uterine horns is where the fetal pigs will develop. The uterine body then continues down into this tubular structure, which is referred to as vagina. The vagina then meets up with this tubular structure called the urethra. Note that in a female, the urethra extends from the urinary bladder and will continue to extend down to this point. Also observe that the urethra and the vagina join at this point and then become a common chamber called the urogenital sinus. The urogenital sinus will then lead to the urogenital opening. As a result, the urogenital opening and the urogenital sinus serve two functions. One is to release urine, that's the expiratory function. The other is that the male penis will insert through the urogenital opening, depositing the sperm. The next section that we'll study will be the circulatory system.
Okay. For the urogenital system, you have to specify if you're going to identify a male or a female pig.
You need to do both?
You need to do one or the other. Okay? Yep. So if you're going to identify a female pig, you should not have testes listed anywhere near it.
Yeah.
Clear?
Just drinking my cup.
We're now ready to begin our study of the circulatory system. In the thoracic cavity of the pig, we see the heart. Covering the heart is a very thin tissue called the pericardium. We will now remove the pericardium, exposing the heart. Observe that the heart is four-chambered. The upper two chambers are referred to as the atria. The lower two chambers are referred to as the ventricles. Running along the front side of the heart are two very small vessels referred to as the coronary artery and the coronary vein. The coronary artery feeds the heart with oxygenated blood. As blood enters the heart, it enters into the right atrium, then passes down into the right ventricle. In the adult specimen, the right side of the heart carries deoxygenated blood. As a result, that blood must be pumped to the lungs to pick up oxygen. So the right ventricle would pump blood out through this tube, which is referred to as a pulmonary trunk. That tube then splits into the right and left pulmonary arteries, going to the lungs, picking up oxygen, then will return to the heart on the left side carrying oxygenated blood. At this point, we have the left atrium. The left atrium then forces blood down into the left ventricle, which then pumps blood out through this massive tube called the aorta. In the fetal pig, however, we do not want the blood to go to the lungs because there's no oxygen there. As a result, between the pulmonary artery and the aorta, look for a very, very small blood vessel that hooks these two up. This blood vessel is known as a ductus arteriosus. Instead, in the venous system, we need to look at these blue vessels which have been injected with blue dye. These are veins. In the neck region, we can see a pair of veins that are known as the internal and external jugulars. They will drain blood from the head and neck region. Note that they come down to this point, join the ones on the other side, and form the cranial vena cava. The cranial vena cava will then dump into the right atrium. In looking at the systemic circulation, we need to remove these veins to expose the arteries. We'll just lift these off the top of the arteries.
What?
And in doing so, we've now exposed the arterial system. Note this major blood vessel that arches up and around. At this point, it is referred to as the aortic arch. The aortic arch has two main branches. The first branch, extending off the aorta, is a brachiocephalic. It will continue cranially and divide into two sections. The first artery branching off the brachiocephalic is a right subclavian. It will continue down into the arm. The other branch coming off the brachiocephalic is a carotid trunk. This is a very small vessel which will then bifurcate into the left and right common carotids. The carotids carry the blood to the head region. The second branch off the aorta is the left subclavian. The left subclavian will continue into the left arm. In our next section, we will study the respiratory system.
Okay. For the circulatory system, there are figures in the lab manual to help you with the spelling. Okay? There's also a list of functions given on the application. Everyone ready for respiratory?
Yeah.
That's the last one?
Let's put it in there.
So the methods for that one is basically like moving on.
I'm gonna let it go.
Artery.
Yeah, so she moved the venous system out, so to expose the arterial system.
What?
She moved the venous system.
She moved the vein to expose the artery.
Right.
To expose the what?
Artery.
Arterial system.
You're a dirty ass nigga. You're a dirty ass nigga. Whatever.
We're now ready for our study of the respiratory system. Air enters the pig through the nostrils, also referred to as the external nares, and the air also enters through the mouth region. Within the pharynx, we can see this opening called the glottis. The glottis leads to the windpipe. This large cartilaginous structure in the throat region is the voice box, anatomically referred to as the larynx. Continuing down towards the lungs is this cartilaginous tube, which is called the trachea, commonly referred to as a windpipe. It might be worth mentioning at this time that underneath the trachea is this other tubular structure made up of muscle called the esophagus that leads towards the stomach, it being a digestive organ. The trachea then continues down into the right and left lungs. The right lung is made up of 3 lobes, whereas the left lung is composed of 4 lobes. In our next section, we'll observe the nervous system.
All right, short and to the point. Okay? Everyone has instructions?
Yes.
Hold on a second, that's okay.
We are now ready to begin our study of the nervous system. I have removed the skull from around the brain and the vertebrae from around the spinal cord. The brain is composed of the left and right cerebral hemispheres. The cerebral hemispheres function in controlling muscular activity and thought processes. Separating the 2 cerebral hemispheres is a very deep groove called the longitudinal fissure. If we go deep enough, we reach some tissue called the corpus callosum that connects the left and right cerebral hemispheres. Behind the cerebral hemispheres, and a little bit lower, is the cerebellum. The cerebellum functions in muscle coordination. Extending from the cerebellum is the medulla oblongata, which regulates the internal organs. Extending from the skull, which has already been removed at this point, is a spinal cord. The spinal cord functions in carrying messages to the brain and away from the brain.
Dissecting the fetal pig is only one of the many ways to learn more about mammals. We hope that this demonstration has not only helped you learn about the anatomy and physiology of the fetal pig, but given you a greater understanding of your own body.
Okay. Does anyone want to rewatch the nervous system?
No.
You got your spelling?
Yeah.
That's great. Right along, advice.
It's a shame that my time coming here.
Remember, like,
Okay.
don't move like films, because
One last time for those who came in late.
I mean,
I can see you like films.
Next week, May 2nd, we're on Zoom. You're on your own.
just stop recording.
Go on a Wednesday because it's free. Any other day, you have to pay. May 9th, we meet here first, and then we're going to go to the botanical garden. Okay? So the lab report for the fetal pig. In your background, what is the dissection? What can we learn from it? What's the purpose of it? X, Y, and Z. You've done that before. Yes?
Yeah.
Purpose of this lab? Anyone?
To learn how to dissect.
So I think I heard to learn and observe the internal and external anatomy of the fetal pig? Yes. Something like that? Okay. The materials are only the materials seen in the video.
Poker and the scalpel.
Pretty much. In the
Do you want us to count the tray and the pins and the dust and all that?
There were no, well,
Strings.
I think we all know what was in the video. Let's move on.
yeah. It's, ideally, you got the poker and
The scalpel.
not scalpel.
Trying to get specific.
Methods,
The pliers, the tweezers.
the methods have to do with what was shown in the video. Yeah, so something like, oh, she removes the peritoneum to show the kidney. Right, in the urogeneral system, so that would be one type of method for that. Okay? The respiratory would be use the poker to identify the 4 lobes of the left one.
The what?
The 4 lobes of the left one. And then for your observations for each one of the sections, not including making incisions, give the structure and function of 3 structures in that section. Everyone